And welcome to this revision video on the character of Gerald Croft from J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls. I'm making this video to help you out with your WJEC English Literature Unit 2A exam, and I'm hoping this can be a really useful revision resource for you as you get ready for your exam. Before we start structuring an answer to the questions, we need to know what the questions might look like in the exam. Now, I've taken two questions. This one is from the 2018 paper, which says, Gerald Croft is presented as a character who is neither good nor bad. How far do you agree with this statement? Remember to support your answer with reference to the play and comment on its social, cultural, and historical context. In a question like this, you're given a quotation where you could agree or you could disagree. Now, it's not my job to tell you what you think about the character. You might think he's redeemable. You might think he's condemnable. It's completely up to you what your viewpoint is. My central piece of advice on a question that gives you an opinion like this is to be firm in your convictions. Think carefully about, do you agree or disagree? And that should probably make its way into your introduction. It should probably be the driver all the way through your essay, and you need to revisit that quotation again at the conclusion just to show your examiner that you have really thought about this. Now, for the purpose of this video, I am going to disagree with this quotation. I know lots of people think he's morally ambiguous. I know lots of people think, well, he tries to be good and he tries to be chivalrous, but on the other hand, he does use Eva Smith. For me, I'm going to argue that I don't think Gerald is neither good nor bad. I think the fact that he doesn't change at the end of this play and that he's willing to go back to his life of exploitation, that makes him more of a bad character than it does a good character. So for the purposes of this video, that will be the direction that I will argue. You are absolutely well within your rights to argue the complete opposite. After all, this is English literature. It is focused on opinions and arguments and viewpoints. So please be authentic to what you believe rather than just taking my viewpoint as a correct answer. Now, if you are given an opinion like this, it's wonderful. But in 2024, sometimes it's not just the single character that turns up. Sometimes it's a pair of characters. So in 2024, the exam paper said, what does the relationship between Gerald and Sheila, as it is presented in An Inspector Calls, show an audience about life in Britain at the time in which the play is set? This time it isn't just the character you're focusing on, but the relationship between these two very wealthy people. Now, you need to respond to the question that's given to you. I'll focus mostly on Gerald Croft as a single character because I think the knowledge that you develop from our analysis of the quotations will be useful to the relationship question as well. In the 40 minutes you're given to write your character question, if I was focusing on the character of Gerald, I would begin with an introduction where I really clearly state what my viewpoint of the character is and what that character might represent. I'd like to reference some kind of historical context in there to show that I understand that Gerald is a construction. He's not a real person. He was invented by Priestley to serve a purpose, to tell us something about the world. And then I'd also like to signpost my argument, to show my examiner where I'm going to go with my argument, and hopefully I'll be able to argue my viewpoint all the way through. Now, if I was to choose a first main section to really exemplify why I think Gerald isn't as wonderful a person as he might appear, I'm going to begin with how he's presented before he confesses. Because I think the way he's presented at the beginning of this text is very different to how he's presented in the middle. And then at the end of the text, he reverts back to the person he was at the beginning, and it shows he doesn't develop as the character. Whilst Sheila and Eric learn their lessons and move forward as characters, Gerald almost seems to go back into the cycle of exploitation. Now, when I focus on my section on before he confesses, I really want to draw out on the fact that Gerald looks good on the outside. Superficially, he seems like an impressive individual. He seems to be kind and polite and generous. But from the very start of this text, He does lie to Sheila, and he does conceal his sins. And when other people are being interrogated, he passes judgment on them, even though he himself has done things that are morally reprehensible. So I'm going to start off with how he's an eligible bachelor at the beginning, and Mr. and Mrs. Burling are desperate to take his signature and add it to the marriage certificate. And then I'm going to move on to how he's presented during his confession. Now, I'm quite conscious that my essay is developing chronologically. Starts at the beginning, then moves on to the middle, and then we'll move on to the end. Now, I need to be very careful that my essay doesn't become narrative. I'm not retelling you who Gerald is and what he does. I'm going to expose what is revealed about this character when he confesses. Because before he confesses, he lies. He says he's never met this person and he's never seen her. It takes the inspector to reveal his lies before eventually he does confess. At the end of the text, he is one of the characters that could change. He could be like Sheila and Eric, and he could begin to make alterations that might make the world a slightly better place. But he chooses not to. Hence why my argument is that he's more of a bad character than a good character. At the very end, I will draw my essay to a conclusion. By mapping out my essay like this, I can see exactly where my essay is going to go and how I'm going to argue my points. Now, if I was going to write an essay on the character of Gerald and Sheila, I could do it in exactly the same way, but instead, I'm going to choose this structure. I'm going to start with an introduction and I'm going to explain that the marriage between Gerald and Sheila is incredibly comfortable, and the relationship between Gerald and Sheila is just going to perpetuate rampant capitalism. Sheila wants to marry Gerald because she has been groomed her entire life to make sure she finds a rich and attractive husband. And for her and for her family, this is a really good fit, and it will allow them to continue their wealth and to maintain that wealth in their family. Now, my first main section is going to be how Gerald seems respectable and desirable, and Sheila's position is to make Gerald happy. My second main section will be how Gerald tries to escape being revealed. He's willing to lie to her, and he believes that he acted honorably. In our fourth section, I'm going to focus on the fact that Gerald doesn't try and redeem himself. He goes back to his original ways. Now, throughout this essay, because the focus is on what it tells us about life at this time, life in the text, I'm going to make much more of a deal about the fact that Sheila is very, very compliant. Sheila does what she's told. She's constantly saying yes, and she's constantly saying sorry, because she accepts her position at the beginning of this text as a pre-suffragette woman. She is dutiful. She is attractive and excited, everything that a young man in 1912 might very well want. I'm going to focus on the fact that Gerald represents the morally dubious aristocracy at the time. Types of people that have plenty of money and they appear to be doing the right thing, but really they're benefiting from the inequality in the world and the injustice in the world just as much as the industrialists with big businesses. I'm also going to focus on the fact that Gerald uses the vulnerable character. So Eva is the symbol of the proletariat, someone who is easily exposed, easily vulnerable, has no real way of succeeding for herself. And we know that Gerald has not just preyed on her, but preyed on others in the past. We know he frequently visits prostitutes. He's going often to places like the Palace Bar. So it also shows us the inequality in power between the rich in 1912 and the much weaker, the much poorer in 1912 too. I've written an introduction to really show what my views are and to show how I'm going to start my essay. Now I'm going to first of all share the introduction with you, and then I'm going to break down how I've constructed it and how I think it leads to a sensible beginning of an argument. So my introduction begins. Throughout in Inspector Calls, J.B. Priestley uses the character of Gerald to expose the hypocrisy of the Edwardian upper class. Like many aristocrats in 1912, Gerald presents himself as honourable and morally upright, yet he is equally complicit in the exploitation of vulnerable individuals, much like bourgeois industrialists such as Mr. Burling. Although he initially appears charming and respectable, Gerald's willingness to lie to conceal his secrets, his affair with Eva Smith while engaged to Sheila, and his refusal to accept the inspector's moral lesson reveal his true character. By the end of the play, he chooses to ignore what he has learned, preferring the comforts of unchallenged capitalism even when he knows it comes at the expense of others, making it difficult to agree that he is a character who is neither good nor bad. Now, the way I've constructed my introduction is, first of all, I want to show you that I know why Priestley is showing us something. I know what Priestley wants to show us about Gerald, because I think Gerald symbolizes hypocrisy. He says one thing but means another. He presents himself as honourable but visits prostitutes. So this is the type of person that I think is superficial and is willing to hide from reality, and he only actually says sorry or admits to his crimes when the inspector actually reveals it. And there's a part of Gerald that makes me think that he apologizes because he's been caught. He's not apologizing because he genuinely feels it. The second part of my introduction is I've tried to explain why. I've tried to explain why Priestley is showing us this image of a very, very rich person that only says sorry, that only acts morally when he's actually shown to be immoral. The next part of my introduction, I tried to signpost my argument. And I think I've managed to do this in one sentence. You can quite clearly see from the purple writing on the screen that my first paragraph is going to be the fact that he's charming and respectable. Maybe my second will be the fact that he has an affair. And then my third one is the fact that he doesn't learn his lesson. At the end of this introduction, I've tried to show what the main message Priestley is trying to convey. And more importantly, I've linked in the original quote to show that my essay is arguing a point of view. It's not just a load of sentences of things I know about Gerald. I'm using all of that information to show you why I don't think he is morally ambiguous. And actually, he's just not a very nice person. I'm going to structure this video into 3 main sections. Each one will be one of the main paragraphs that go into my essay. Now I'm going to include lots of quotations, probably more quotations than you'll use in a single essay, but I'd rather give you slightly too many quotations than not enough. So my first main section is that before his confession, he presents himself as lovely, a knight in shining armour, someone who's there to defend others, who's there to make Sheila happy, and he seems to be kind, and he seems to be honourable, and he seems to be chivalrous. The very first description we have of Gerald is in Stage Directions, and it describes him as an attractive chap about 30. Now, the fact that the word attractive is used there, for me, instantly creates an element of superficiality. He seems to be, on the outside, very good looking, and the word chap next to it gives him a sense of easiness, a confidence. This is somebody who has had a very easy life, who has had all of the privileges, all of the excesses that a capitalist upbringing can give him. And as a result, he seems very, very happy with life. The world is his oyster, everything is there for the taking. Now, the fact that he is about 30 puts him in a position where he probably is thinking of having a wife. Now, up until this point, he hasn't been married. Up until this point, he has enjoyed his younger times of his life. Now, the fact that he's not married until he gets to 30, it sounds like he's ready to now settle down, but it does give us a consideration of what he's been doing, how he's been enjoying himself up until this point. Now, we find out later that he has spent his youth enjoying the company of women, enjoying the company of quite illicit places like bars and hotels where prostitutes hang out. And he's definitely the type of person that has enjoyed all of the excesses of life, not just the types of pleasures that good people might enjoy. Now, he's also described as rather too manly to be a dandy. Now, it makes him sound like quite a masculine figure, obviously very desirable. And the fact that he's not a dandy shows he's not effeminate. His upbringing hasn't turned him into something different. What it has done is allowed him to fully prosper. He has been able to become the type of person that everyone would like to be. And that's because money gives opportunities and money gives chances in life. The last quotation for the description is very much the easy, well-bred, young man about town. Now that's quite a complex phrase. If he's described as an easy, well-bred young man, again, that shows that he's probably very well educated. Money has bought him a very good education. Easy means his life is easy. He's confident. He's not had to struggle for everything. He hasn't earned this privilege. This privilege has been given to him. And now when he's described as a man about town, that shows this is the type of person that has had experiences. But man about town, I think, gives us a sense of foreshadowing. And I think the foreshadowing is that this is somebody who has been around the town. This is the type of person that has visited prostitutes, has known lots of women. So he does sound quite a virile, quite attractive, and quite a desirable man that has definitely enjoyed himself. Now, all of those quotations, I think, combine to show him as quite a sophisticated man that probably a lot of people look up to and aspire to be like. Now, in Edwardian England, social advancement was difficult for women. What I mean by social advancement is to attain a better life for yourself, to improve your social standing, to move from the proletariat up to the bourgeoisie, or from the bourgeoisie up into the aristocracy. It was incredibly difficult for women to do that on their own. Now, Arthur and Sybil at the beginning of this text, they see it as their duty to secure a prosperous marriage for Sheila. Now, the lexical set of business is used all the way through that first act. And that's really to show that for Arthur, he sees this as a transaction. He sees this as how can he gain what he wants, the type of son-in-law I always wanted, and how he can also improve Sheila's social standing. For Sybil, I think she sees the opportunity of Gerald, and she actually places the opportunity of Gerald over Sheila's happiness. She even tells Sheila that you're going to have to get used to this when you get married to Gerald, because Gerald's going to be a man who owns a business and he's important. And so both of them place a real sense of duty on themselves to secure a prosperous marriage for Sheila. Now, I don't think they're awful people for trying to help Sheila marry well, but their intentions are definitely financial and economic, rather than purely for what's best for Sheila. Now, at this time, women had very few opportunities for social advancement, but marriage was absolutely key for women in improving the standing of wealthy families. Now, I want you to think for a second about how Sheila and Gerald's marriage seems to be sensible. Gerald is marrying slightly below him, and his parents don't really like that, but it's not too bad. For Sheila, she's marrying up, which is exactly what a woman in Edwardian England should be looking to do. But if we consider the motivations of Eva, then it becomes a little bit more sinister. I think that Gerald knows that Eva would like the idea of marrying Gerald, not just because she loves him, but because he would be the solution to all of her problems. And I think he exploits that expectation for women to marry up, and he uses it for his own self-gratification. Beginning of the text, Arthur and Sybil are constantly trying to impress Gerald. It's almost sycophantic in some cases. A sycophant is someone who will compliment and compliment and compliment to get what they want. Now, when Mr. Burling says, "You ought to like this port, Gerald. As a matter of fact, Finchley told me it's exactly the same port your father gets from him." Now, at this stage, I think Arthur is desperately trying to impress not just Gerald, but Gerald's father too. He's trying to present himself as on the same level as Gerald, even though socially Mr. Burling would be considered Gerald's inferior. The fact that Mr. Burling deliberately goes to the person who sells port to Gerald's father shows the extent to which he is trying to show himself and his daughter to be worthy of this man. Now, I always feel slightly uncomfortable when Mr. Burling compliments Gerald as just the kind of son-in-law I always wanted. Now, it's the personal pronoun I that makes me feel uncomfortable, because this really does show that there is a motivation for Arthur to get what he wants, not just for Sheila to get what she desires. And Mrs. Burling does the same thing. "Sheila's a lucky girl, and I think you're a pretty fortunate young man too, Gerald." Now, what we've got is this idea that Sheila is the one to be considered lucky first. And if she is lucky, then it's almost too good to be true, and that's the reason why she is marrying him. The word lucky there shows that Sheila should be very pleased with getting Gerald, because he is desirable and he is eligible, and he will help improve her social standing. Mr. and Mrs. Burling are aware that Gerald is socially superior, and they reference this quite frequently. Now, Mr. Burling sounds a little bit uncomfortable. At times there's a slight awkwardness when he says, "It's a pity Sir George and Lady Croft can't be with us." You've got the verbal filler in the middle to show that it is slightly unpleasant that his daughter isn't considered worthy. Now, I want you to pay a real attention to the fact that he calls George Sir and Croft Lady. He uses those respectful terms to show that he knows that they are socially superior, but he desires to be like them. And he admits the fact that Sheila might not be considered a social equal. And he says, I have an idea that your mother, Lady Croft, while she doesn't object to my girl, feels you might have done better for yourself socially. Now, we consider Lady Croft to have the same motivations as Mr. and Mrs. Burling. The parents very much focus on the financial success of the marriage rather than any kind of love in the marriage. Now, in order to prove himself worthy and in order to show that he too will be promoted of his own merit, he starts to brag quite foolishly about something that hasn't happened yet, but he feels confident is going to happen. And he says to Gerald, "Oh, just a knighthood, of course." Now, he's deliberately dropping these terms in to show that perhaps this family is worthy of his time. And to this, Gerald says, "Oh, I say, congratulations." Gerald is clearly quite impressed by titles and by looks and by social status. When Arthur stands up and pontificates to the entire dining room, he uses words that are more focused on business than they might be for a marriage. And he sees Gerald not just as a good opportunity for his daughter, but also a good business partner too. After all, they are rivals in business. So this quotation, "Your father and I have been friendly rivals in business for some time now, though Crofts Limited are both older and bigger than Burling and Company." And I think I'd focus on the term friendly rivals. Now, those two are almost oxymoronic in the way that they're used. A rival is someone that is acting against someone else, whilst friendly is someone that acts with someone. Now, friendly rivals shows that whilst Gerald's family and Arthur's family are competing against each other in business, it's in their best interests that they both do well. Now what we've got is we've almost got a camaraderie, almost like a friendliness amongst the rich and powerful people, because it's in their interest to make sure that they all stay in control and they don't give too much power. So for example, if Crofts Limited were to increase their wages, then that would have an impact on Burling, because Burling would have to do the same thing and then he would lose money. So there seems to be a commonality between these two businesses to maintain their own interests first. Now, Burling sees an opportunity to combine these two businesses together so that they become even more dominant in the market, essentially creating a monopoly. And monopolies are really dangerous because when there is no competition, if these two businesses come together, when there is no competition, then prices can get higher and higher and higher, and people continue to buy the products because they don't have a competitor to go to instead. So what this does do is create a real relationship between capitalists. It's in their best interest for business to go well. And that's exactly what Arthur talks about. He says, we look forward to the time Crofts and Burlings are no longer competing, but working together for lower costs and higher prices. Now what this shows us is that the elite at the time had vested interests. It was in their interests to keep costs low and to keep prices high, so they could continue to reap greater and greater profits at the expense of the people working in the factories. What this shows us is that Arthur sees Gerald as attractive, not just physically, not just for his daughter, but for his own financial gain too. Now, up until the inspector arrives, Gerald presents himself as a romantic and chivalrous and kind and thoughtful man. I mean, later on in the text, we know that all of this is wrong because visiting prostitutes is not romantic and being willing to exploit vulnerable women is not chivalrous at all. But he really enjoys looking chivalrous and he really enjoys looking respectable. And he plays up to it. And when he's toasting his wife-to-be, he says, "And I drink to you and hope I can make you as happy as you deserve to be." Now that would be incredibly sweet and that would be very heartfelt if we didn't have the knowledge at the end of the play that Gerald, whilst engaged to Sheila, was visiting other women. It's superficially, on the outside, it sounds lovely and kind and romantic. But with the dramatic irony we have at the end of the text, then it seems to be superficial and it seems to be a barefaced lie. Now, during that original scene in the dining room, he produces a ring case and gives this diamond ring to Sheila. And I think the diamond ring is a really good symbol of the excesses of capitalism. Whilst he's willing to give a diamond ring to Sheila, he wasn't willing to do the same thing to Eva. Now he's happy to present her with a ring, this symbol of capitalistic excess, because he is going to marry Sheila, because she is much closer to him in social standing. But he never intended to marry Eva. Eva was only there for his temporary pleasure. So whilst it's incredibly lovely that he will dedicate himself to Sheila, we also now have the knowledge that he wasn't willing to do that to Eva. Right at the beginning of the start of the text, we also see that Gerald is actually very similar in values to Mr. Burling. And you can see this through pairs of quotations. When Mr. Burling says, "And we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity," the first person to speak is Gerald, who agrees with him. "I believe you're right, sir." And when Mr. Burling says about Eva, who caused trouble in his factory, "She had to go," Gerald agrees. "You couldn't have done anything else." And when Mr. Burling says, "Rubbish, if you don't come down sharply on some of these people," They'll soon be asking for the earth. Gerald says, I should say so. Now what you'll notice is all of the things that Arthur says, Gerald agrees with. But all of the things Arthur says, the inspector disagrees with. So the inspector reveals all the way through Arthur's testimony that all of the assumptions he made, they weren't the only option. And I think that applies to Gerald too. Gerald feeling like the only thing he could do was to give Eva money and put her in this room and make love to her, the inspector essentially shows us that there are other ways of acting. And all the way through this text, I think that's the purpose of the inspector, to show what's been done, to show the consequences of it, and to encourage each character and the audience themselves to maybe choose the consequence that doesn't hurt others. And I think when it comes to Gerald, that's really important. And when Mr. Burling says, I was quite justified, he says, yes, I think you were. I know we'd have done the same thing. Now this is where we can start to see Gerald as the next Mr. Burling. If Gerald continues and doesn't change, he is just going to add to the pernicious cycle of capitalism that is going to continue until someone breaks it. The inspector tries to break that cycle of capitalism. Gerald at the beginning of this text is quite happy for that to carry on. He's quite happy for capitalism to continue, for socialism to be stamped out, for strikes to be broken. Gerald is quite happy with the status quo. He has a wonderful life. The world is his oyster. There is no reason for him to want to change. And he's the same as Mr. Burling at the beginning of the text. This is where I'll start to reveal some of the more unpleasant things about Gerald's character from the beginning. Superficially, he looks wonderful, desirable, sophisticated, but underneath it, I think there's a very sinister undercurrent. Now, at the very start of the text, and you can see on the screen I've said page 3, when Sheila questions where Gerald was that summer, where he wouldn't come anywhere near her, he says to her, to her face, and I've told you, I was awfully busy at the works all the time. That's a direct lie to Sheila. Now he's willing to say to Sheila that I want you to be happy, but at the same time, he's also willing to lie to her. Now at this stage, the lie is not undiscovered, and he's quite comfortable lying, because I feel like Gerald is the type of person that will lie to conceal his true identity. He will lie to conceal his crimes, and he'll only confess when he doesn't have another choice, and even then to try and control what is said. Another unpleasant hint that we see in Gerald from the very beginning is when Mr. Burling confesses that in his youth he also enjoyed himself, when he's talking about Eric and his drinking and his acquaintances with women. Arthur says that he enjoyed his younger years too. And Gerald takes great pleasure in this and says, I'll bet you did. He enjoys the immoral actions that other people show, and it shows that he also is enjoying his own immorality before he settles down with Sheila. I think these are some hints of underneath the superficial facade, there is something a little bit more sinister creeping under the surface. Okay, so that was my first section. Essentially, I'm going to argue that Gerald on the outside presents himself as morally superior, kind and lovely and loving, but underneath it all there are sinister hints. I'm now going to move on to when Gerald confesses. When the inspector begins his interrogation, the first thing that Gerald does is lies directly to Sheila. And I think he lies to protect his reputation. He wants to get away with his crimes rather than have them exposed. The first thing he says to Sheila is, I didn't. It's very assertive, it's very clear, and it's almost believable. Now, this is someone who seems to be quite good at lying. Eventually, he is willing to admit the fact that he has acted immorally, but he isn't willing to go into detail. He's trying to control it. He's trying to make sure that it isn't blown out of proportion. What he's trying to do is to suppress the fallout from revealing his crimes. And it's almost reluctant. He doesn't want to share these views. Now, you'll notice by the very short sentences of mostly monosyllabic words, because he is trying not to say too much and he's trying to protect his reputation. He says, all right, I knew her. Let's leave it at that. Now, that control that he's showing reveals that his reputation means a lot to him, and he doesn't want these crimes to be exposed. He's almost asking him to be left alone. Now, where it says, I knew her, he doesn't immediately confess to the fact that he knew her intimately. He tries to brush it away. He tries to under-exaggerate it. He tries to suggest that it isn't worthy of attention. Now, where it says, let's leave it at that, he is very much telling Sheila that it's time for her to be quiet. Now, he's assuming his patriarchal power there. He's assuming his power as an aristocratic figure, a social superior, and that it's Sheila's, the expectation of Sheila is to be dutiful and to be subservient here and to bow to his will. And Sheila doesn't let it go. So the way that Gerald then reacts is by not replying. On multiple occasions, the stage direction says he does not reply. He does not reply, but looks at her. Now, this is someone who is trying to escape the retribution for his crimes. He's so far said very, very little, and then he drops into silence completely. This is not someone who is ready to confess their sins. He is very reluctantly being pushed to do so. Sheila, on the other hand, almost blurts out her sins straight away because she's uncontrollably emotional. But Gerald is much more reserved and much more controlled. He knows exactly what's happened, and he isn't emotionally willing to tell others. Now, eventually, Gerald agrees to apologize. But his apology comes almost with an explanation, almost trying to explain it away and make it sound not very serious. He says, I'm sorry, Sheila. Now, from that apology, I don't believe that he's truly apologizing to Sheila. I feel like I'm sorry reveals more that he's sorry he's been discovered. He would have been quite happy to maintain his facade as this knight in shining armor, or as Sheila says, a fairy prince, because he wants to escape being seen for what he is. He then says, but it was all over and done with last summer. I hadn't set eyes on the girl for at least 6 months. Now, where he says it was all over and done with last summer, he believes because it's in the past, it's no longer consequential. To Sheila, this is very, very important, but Gerald is trying to explain it away as almost it doesn't mean anything. Now, where he says I hadn't set eyes on the girl, the word girl there makes us feel uncomfortable because it presents Eva Smith as vulnerable, but it also makes her sound almost unimportant to him. It's been 6 months since I've last seen her. When Sheila says that she's now found out that she's part of the reason why Eva committed suicide, when she says she knows that, Gerald says you don't. Neither of us does. So Gerald is not willing to accept the fact that he has been a part in the chain of events that the inspector is talking about, and he's trying to continue his argument of not being involved, that his actions didn't have consequences. He then asks Sheila to suppress her emotions and to make sure that he isn't revealed. He says, so for God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector. And you'll see the imperative verb don't, where he's again using his patriarchal dominance to tell Sheila what she should not do. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to escape being exposed. Now, Before he's willing to properly confess to the inspector, he says to him, "Inspector, I think Miss Burling ought to be excused." Now, we might consider this chivalrous in the fact that he's trying to protect Miss Burling from some unpleasant events that she will hear. Or on the other hand, we could consider Gerald trying to make sure that she doesn't hear him, so that he doesn't lose his reputation as being a chivalrous person. Again, I think he's trying to send Sheila away because he's trying to protect the way that people see him. And he does this in quite a patronizing way, considering this is the person he seeks to marry. He says that she's had a long, exciting, and tiring day. Now that fling of adjectives, long, exciting, and tiring, that makes it sound that Sheila is to blame for the reason why he wants to send her away. He places all of that blame on Sheila as if he has her best interest at heart. I think I would argue if he truly had her best interests at heart, perhaps he wouldn't have visited prostitutes, and he probably wouldn't have been sleeping with Eva Smith whilst engaged to Sheila. When Gerald begins his confession, we learn that he frequently visits bars and hotels. Now, there's only two reasons why he might do so. One, to drink alcohol. Two, to visit the type of women that might hang out in these places. This quotation, "I happened to look in one night after a long, dull day, and as the show wasn't very bright, I went down into the bar for a drink. It's a favourite haunt of women of the town." Now, what this presents Gerald as is the type of person that becomes disinterested in the type of entertainment that others might enjoy. So there was a show going on, he found it particularly dull and not exciting enough, which tells us that Gerald is the type of person that secretly finds excitement from far more dangerous or far more illicit pursuits. The fact that he had a long, dull day, presumably at the factory, shows that he was looking for his own type of entertainment, and the fact that he chose deliberately to go to the Palace Bar to go for a drink, I mean, that's a euphemism for visiting the women of the town, the prostitutes of Brumley. Now, I think that shows that if he is going there deliberately to seek out these women, then that really does show that there is a predatory element of Gerald. Gerald has all of the power in that relationship as a man with money, and the women that he is exploiting have no power at all, and in fact are probably in very difficult circumstances, and he's willing to exploit that. Now, when he describes the prostitutes that he often sees at the bar, he describes them as, "I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women." That's how he presents the women that he often goes to visit in bars. Now, the word hate is a verb that is particularly strong. He's obviously become frustrated or disinterested in the types of prostitutes that he normally visits, and he describes them as hard-eyed. That makes them sound almost emotionless. So perhaps the prostitutes who sell their body has led to them becoming emotionally hard and emotionally distant and emotionally traumatized. He also describes them as dough-faced. Perhaps they're not as attractive as he wants them to be. He objectifies women sexually, and he is frustrated when those women don't meet his expectations. Now, part of the reason why I think his eyes light on Eva, or Daisy Renton as she is known when he meets her, is because she's different, and she's no longer completely destroyed by a life of prostitution, and it excites him more because she seems vulnerable, and she seems inexperienced, and she seems like the type of person that he might enjoy. Now, we might describe it as positive that he went to save her, or we might consider it predatory, the fact that his eyes lighted on someone he desired, and then pretended to be chivalrous in order to gain access to what he wanted. As we approach his confession, where he explains how he met Eva in the first place, we can see that he genuinely believes that he was defending Eva. Now, this is something that Gerald has already admitted to before the before the confession, he was questioned by the inspector, and the inspector said, "And do you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things?" And Gerald, earlier on, to show his chivalry, said, if possible, yes. So Gerald identifies as a defender of the vulnerable, as someone who is kind to women. But the inspector from the beginning has realized that perhaps Gerald is the type of person that women also should be protected from. And we can see that when Gerald recounts the way that he met Eva for the first time. Gerald believed he did the right thing when he protected her from old Joe Meggerty. Now, I think old Joe Meggerty is a really useful symbol to use in an exam, because old Joe Meggerty is a symbol of the type of masculine figure that will abuse his position of power in order to sexually gratify himself. Old Joe Meggerty sees women as disposable objects and that they are there purely for his own enjoyment. So old Joe Meggerty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. Now, as a quotation, that is very derogatory towards Joe Meggerty. He's an alderman, so he's a person of authority in the town. But Gerald looks down upon him. You'll take a look at the adjectives used to describe him. First of all, old, it's a derogatory description. And then the adjectives obscene, fat, and also half-drunk and goggle-eyed. Now, Joe Meggerty is symbolizing a predatory older man who is preying on vulnerable women. Half-drunk shows that this is someone who is out of control. Goggle-eyed shows that he's the type of person that is drunk but also lustful, which is quite unpleasant. And the fact that he had wedged her into a corner creates this imagery of a predator and prey. Wedged shows that there's little escape for Eva at this point, and that Joe is physically dominating that presence. He is restricting her access. He is not letting her go. The fact that she's into a corner presents her very much as an animal who has been backed into a corner and cannot escape. And then the description of him being fat and obscene are physically grotesque images. And yet the word carcass really shows that he is almost this festering, horrible, physically obese man. And there's almost a kind of sense of death around him because he preys upon these women. They're his victims. So for Gerald, he believes he is doing the morally correct thing in identifying injustice and lack of power, and he steps in and he believes that he can save this woman. Now, he describes Joe Meggerty as a notorious womanizer, as well as being one of the worst sots and rogues in Brumley. Now, a notorious womanizer is someone who is constantly bedding women and everyone knows about it. Notorious means famous, famous for bad reasons. And he also describes him as a worst sot and rogue in Brumley. He really looks down on Joe Meggerty, even though Mrs. Burling looks up to him. Mrs. Burling looks up to Alderman Meggerty because of his title and his status in the town. And it shows that Mr. and Mrs. Burling are easily distracted by titles. They're easily impressed by when people look impressive, and they don't really see the type of character that's beneath the surface. Now, there are some real connections that I'll pose in just a second between old Joe Meggerty and his intentions and the intentions of Gerald too. And he describes, "The girl saw me looking at her and then gave me a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help." Now, for Gerald, he feels that Eva wanted help and that he was able to swoop in and offer the help that she asked for. It's unlikely, however, that she actually cried for help, and part of me thinks that perhaps Gerald saw what he wanted to see. Gerald saw an opportunity to sweep in and be the hero of a story, and then he could use that status in order to seduce the woman that he had saved. The question I pose here is, was Gerald really any different to Joe Meggerty in that bar? I assume Joe Meggerty went to that bar to get drunk and probably to have an affair with a woman, probably a prostitute. And part of me thinks that Gerald went there for the exact same motivation. The only difference between Joe Meggerty and Gerald, then, is not title, because Gerald is from a wealthy family. Joe Meggerty has a very impressive title in the town. So the only difference becomes their superficial looks. In Joe Meggerty, it's grotesque because his body is ugly, whilst with Gerald, his intentions are noble, and that's purely because he looks attractive on the outside. So I think as an informed reader, we need to ask whether Gerald's intentions are different to Joe Meggerty. Now, Gerald may very well believe that his intentions were noble, but when we unpick it to their real motivations, perhaps there's not much difference between Gerald and Joe Meggerty after all. As he is recounting the story of first meeting Eva or Daisy, he does show affection for Eva, and that affection does seem to be genuine in places. The first description of her is, "But then I noticed a girl who looked quite different. She was pretty, soft brown hair and big dark eyes." Now, the reason why Gerald is willing to help Eva is because he finds her attractive. The adjectives pretty, brown, big, dark present her to be an attractive girl. Now, for Gerald, I question whether he would have saved this girl if she wasn't quite as attractive. I think he was enticed by her quite indefensible looks. She seems quite vulnerable, she seems quite young, and she seems quite impressionable. And I think he finds that desirable. Now, as he's confessing, he does break off, as the stage directions tell us, and he does say, "My God." So there does seem to be some genuine warmth and some genuine remorse for what has happened to Eva. And he says, distressed, "Sorry, I've suddenly realized, taken it in properly, that she's dead." So there does seem to be some real remorse for the fact that Eva has died. And the description of her is that she looked young and fresh and charming, and altogether out of place down there. And obviously she wasn't enjoying herself. Now the three adjectives, young, fresh, and charming, again, it makes her sound very young and impressionable, and it makes him sound perhaps as if he preyed upon those vulnerabilities, even if he didn't do it consciously. He must have been somewhat aware that a young, vulnerable woman probably will fall in love with a charming man that comes to save her. Gerald does do some good for Eva. He helps her, but the issue becomes in the way that he helps her. He uses his wealth and privilege to help her. He tells the story that she did let slip, though she didn't mean to, was that she was desperately hard up and at that moment was actually hungry. So we find out just how desperate she was, and Gerald sees an opportunity to fulfill his duty as as a charitable aristocrat, as someone who is morally good and as someone who has a duty to help the less fortunate. But he does so through money. So the fact that she was actually hungry, he then gets the place that they were in at the time to make her some food. So he satisfies one of her desires so that she is no longer hungry. And he also says that, in fact, she hadn't a penny and was going to be turned out of her miserable back room she had. So again, we can see that Eva was physically desperate, but she's also financially desperate. Now, everything that Daisy or Eva doesn't have, Gerald has in abundance. So I insisted on Daisy moving into these rooms, and I made her take some money to keep her going there. Now, for Gerald, he believes that this was completely innocuous. He believes that this was completely innocent, and that he couldn't believe that placing this girl in some rooms that he had access to would lead to them having an affair. I think he's either a little foolish or a little misguided, or he knew what he was doing and he knew that there would be a chance that she would want to make up to him in some way. He remains adamant that there was no abuse of power. So he defends himself and he argues that his intention was to use, he argues that his intentions were not to use his power and privilege to seduce her. He says, I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. Now, there's an emptiness in his voice there, I think, because there is clearly a link between placing a woman in a room and giving her everything she could possibly want and the assumption that she will probably want to do something in return. Now, the word install makes me feel slightly uncomfortable because that sounds quite a financial word to use, almost like there is a transaction where by giving money for one thing, something else returns. But he reasserts that he never meant to seduce her at all. And he says, I was sorry for her and didn't like the idea of her going back to the palace bar. I didn't ask for anything in return. Now there he seems to absolve himself in guilt because he didn't ask. Now that makes him sound like because he didn't ask and she offered, he had no part in it. However, I think his actions perhaps had a suggestion that something else would happen. And for Sheila, she doesn't see his actions purely as chivalrous. Sheila can see beyond the superficial now. She couldn't at the beginning, but now she can cut right through that facade and she can see that Gerald enjoyed his chivalrous reputation of feeling like a defender, someone who can protect women. And she says really sarcastically, you were the wonderful fairy prince. And it taps into these stories that we're told as children of the prince who comes and saves the day. And unfortunately, Eva, or Daisy, is seduced by that. And she fulfills her duty in that story by being the partner to the fairy prince. Now, he is adamant that he didn't abuse his power, but I think I would probably argue that the power dynamic in that situation of an absolutely desperate and grateful woman and the powerful, strong, rich, well-titled man that he is, I think he was perhaps blinding himself or maybe even refusing to see what was right in front of him. We're approaching the end of this section, but I think it's important to realize that Gerald was never going to marry Eva. He knew that from the beginning and yet allowed this affair to continue. He says, hesitatingly, when asked about why the relationship ended, it's hard to say. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. Now, what you can see is that Eva, as a very grateful, very desperate, very vulnerable woman, fell in love with Gerald, the fairy prince who turned up and saved her from, old Joe Meggerty, from a life of prostitution, from poverty, from misery. And he didn't feel the same way. Now that suggests that the relationship for Eva was an emotional relationship that could offer her salvation and a better chance at life. For Gerald, then, it wasn't the same. For Gerald, it must have been physical rather than emotional. It must have been temporary rather than a possible long-term thing. Now, Gerald will have known how Eva would have felt, and Gerald would also be fully aware that he would never marry her. Now, Mrs. Burling describes the relationship as disgusting, and Gerald defends it and says it wasn't disgusting. He doesn't see it as something to be ashamed of, and he says, it wasn't disgusting. For him, he says it was much more meaningful, and he seems to feel genuine remorse, because it says that he waits a moment, then in a low, troubled tone, she told me she'd been happier than she'd ever been before. Now, that's either full of real tragedy, or it's that he feels very happy that he made her a little less miserable than she was before. Now, there's either guilt there because he made her happy and then took it away from her, or he takes genuine pleasure in knowing that he has the ability to have that kind of influence. Now, I would argue Gerald has a lot of responsibility as a man of great fortune, and he abused that responsibility in making a young girl fall in love with him that he never had any intention of marrying. When asked why it came to an end, he says she knew it couldn't last, hadn't expected it to last. She didn't blame me at all. Now, the suggestion there is that Eva allowed herself to believe that perhaps a man of great fortune would be willing to marry a girl from destitution, for a girl from the proletariat who had no opportunities in life. And yet she knew deep down that that wasn't the case. She knew deep down that Gerald had no intention of marrying her. And when it says she didn't blame me at all, it sounds incredibly kind of Eva to forgive her completely for giving her that sense of false hope. But I'm not sure I forgive Gerald in the same way. When the inspector does his final speech, he condemns quite a few of the characters. He tells Mr. Burling that he started this chain of events. He says to Eric Burling that he treated her, used her for the end of a stupid drunken evening as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person. He accuses Sheila and Mrs. Burling for denying charity. But Gerald gets off a little lightly. This is how the inspector reveals Gerald's character. Nor that young man Croft, though he at least had some affection for her and made her happy for a time. So the inspector is much more lenient on Gerald. Perhaps Gerald tried to act in the right way, but maybe for the wrong reasons, or perhaps he acted in the wrong way for the right reasons. Gerald's character is much more ambiguous than the rest. I think the inspector is actually a little bit kinder than I am in the way that I see Gerald. The last section that we're going to cover, this is when Gerald doesn't learn the inspector's lesson. The inspector left it with Gerald perhaps on a knife edge, and he could go either way, couldn't he? Gerald could be seen as a good character that made a mistake, but when Gerald tries to revert back into the character he used to be and doesn't morally develop into a better person, perhaps like Sheila and Eric start their metamorphosis, Gerald reverts. Gerald goes back, like Mr. and Mrs. Burling is happy to go back to ignorance and bliss and perpetuating the cycle of capitalism that exploits the poor. Now, when Gerald returns, he is the one who reveals that perhaps the inspector isn't who he claimed to be. And he asks questions like, but how do you know it's the same girl? And he starts to get quite excited and he starts to get quite enthusiastic about the fact that perhaps this was all a cruel joke. And his desperation to explain away the inspector shows that perhaps he's more interested in getting away with his crimes than for actually learning the message the inspector arrived to tell. And as part of his exposition, he says, there were probably 4 or 5 different girls. And he seems to take pleasure into believing that perhaps the inspector wasn't just talking about one girl. Perhaps it wasn't just one girl that was hurt and damaged and caused to commit suicide. Perhaps there were 4 or 5 different girls that were all treated badly. And I think this is where I start to lose faith in the goodness of Gerald, because it's almost like he would prefer 4 or 5 girls to go through pain than for one girl to go through pain and it impact him. And I think the fact that 4 or 5 girls clearly is a much higher number than one shows that it doesn't matter how many people get hurt as long as it's not him. And that's where I think the character is maybe more morally reprehensible than he was given credit for when the inspector left. When he phones the infirmary to find out whether a dead girl was admitted to the infirmary, again, he's willing to lie. He's willing to put on a voice. He's willing to put on a show, a facade. He's willing to pretend to be worried about someone when secretly he's only acting in his own self-interest. And when he says, we're rather worried about one of our employees, they're not worried about the employees at all. Had he been worried about his employees, and had Mr. Burling been worried about his employees, perhaps the employees wouldn't have been treated so badly. The worry here is fake. The worry is for himself. He's not worried about one of his employees at all. He's worried about his own reputation, and he's really hoping that he can escape being exposed to the public. All he wants to do is get away with his crimes. When everyone in the dining room finds out that there is no woman lying dead in the infirmary, there is celebration and jubilation. And Gerald accepts the celebration. He celebrates the fact that they've all confessed their sins and that they won't be held to account. And he's smiling, and he says, thanks, I think I could just do with that one now, when he was offered a drink. The fact that he accepts the drink shows that he is celebrating getting away with his crimes. He's not celebrating the fact that the girl isn't dead. Now, there's lots of smiling going on at this point, and Mrs. Burling says, and I must say, Gerald, you've argued this very cleverly, and I'm most grateful. And you can see that Gerald is gaining plaudits from Mrs. Burling, because Mrs. Burling, even though she only just called Gerald disgusting for his affair, is now again courting this man as a potential suitor for her daughter, even though she knows that Gerald visits prostitutes and keeps women in bedrooms. She goes back to again trying to make sure that this man enters the family and allows them to economically benefit. They've all forgotten exactly the message that the inspector was there to teach. The crimes haven't gone away, they've just been hidden. And Mr. Burling also wants things to go back to where they were, and he says, look, you'd better ask Gerald for that ring you gave back to him, hadn't you? And it puts Sheila in a position of having to beg Gerald to take her once more. And that really does show that Gerald is seen as this perfect character that can do no wrong, even though his sins have just been exposed to the world. And Gerald accepts it. Gerald sounds really similar to Mr. Burling at the end of this text when he says, everything's all right now, Sheila. I mean, that quotation shows that everything is all right for him. Everything is clearly not all right for the world. And then he holds up the ring, that symbol of capitalistic excess. He is quite happy for the world to stay as it is. He doesn't want to change the world. He doesn't want to alter the status quo because the status quo benefits him so much that it's in his best interest to let inequality go rife. And when he says, what about this ring? I think the symbol of a ring itself is an eternal band that is unbroken, very much like how, with Gerald refusing to learn, then there is very little hope. It means the older generation are reverting back to those old-fashioned, very harsh views of the poor. For Gerald, who is that middle generation who could change like Sheila and Eric, has also decided it's too easy, it's too comfortable, it's in his best interest not to change. So there's an emptiness in meaning when it comes to Gerald. And when he says, what about this ring? What he wants to happen is for things to go back exactly the way they were, and that he can continue to be happy with Sheila, even though the consequences of his actions probably contributed to the death of somebody else. The final points I'd like to make about the character of Gerald is the fact that he doesn't change. Now, all of the quotations I'm going to put on the board are all in juxtaposition to Gerald's character, because Sheila is determined to change. Gerald is quite happy to revert. Gerald is happy for inertia. Gerald doesn't want to move on. Gerald doesn't want to make the world better. It's too comfortable for him, so he wants to continue this capitalistic greed. Now, Sheila says, but you're forgetting the one thing I still can't forget. Everything we said had happened, really happened. For Sheila, she's horrified at the fact that the other characters are forgetting the messages from the inspector. And I think the word forgetting, that verb, is incredibly important because Gerald is content to forget about what's happened. He seemed to want to take responsibility for his actions, and he seemed to show genuine upset at the way he treated this girl. But as soon as it sounds that the girl isn't dead, he instantly absolves himself of guilt, and he doesn't need to change. It's inconvenient to change because the world treats him very well the way it is. And Sheila continues and says, you're pretending everything's just as it was before. And again, I think the word pretending there is really important because Gerald wants to continue to pretend to be a moral character. He's quite happy to go back to pretending to be a good person. And Sheila also says, so nothing really happened. So there's nothing to be sorry for, nothing to learn. We can all go on behaving just as we did. For for Sheila and Eric, I don't think they will continue to act the way they did. But for Gerald, I think just like Arthur and Sheila, he will revert to his old ways and he will continue to commit crimes instead of become a little bit more enlightened and think more carefully about the consequences of his actions. And the last quotation I'm going to leave you again is from Sheila, where she says, you began to learn something and now you've stopped. You're ready to go on in the same old way. And I think the word learn is absolutely essential because Gerald doesn't want to change and doesn't want to learn the lesson. He seemed to be learning the lesson when he showed genuine affection and warmth towards Eva, and now that he has escaped any kind of justice, he's quite happy to go back pretending and not learning the lesson at all. Now, I think all the way through the quotations that we've looked at, the inspector has tried to show us that we are all like bees all mixed up in a hive, like Mr. Burling said, and that there is a chain of events where one thing leads to another, and Gerald completely takes away his part of the chain as inconsequential. He doesn't think he's done anything wrong, and he's unwilling to change, and he just wants things to revert back to the way they were in the past. Through every quotation that I've analysed, I've tried to construct a narrative, to try and construct an argument to show why I think Gerald shouldn't be considered a morally ambiguous character, someone in the middle, someone who's not good but also not awful. I've tried to argue all the way through this video that Gerald should be seen for what he is. Someone who is superficially attractive and very content with their reputation, but underneath it, he has done bad things, and he's quite willing to try and get away with them and to continue acting the way he's always acted. He doesn't learn his lesson. Now, I've constructed a conclusion that could work for this type of essay, and this is what it looks like. In conclusion, Gerald cannot be seen as a morally ambiguous character who is neither good nor bad. Although he briefly shows remorse for his actions and some guilt over how he treated Eva, this is overshadowed by the way he used his wealth and privilege to exploit her for personal gratification, fully aware that she meant little more to him than a temporary pleasure. His unwillingness to change or accept the inspector's message reveals his complicity in a social system that mistreats the vulnerable and his failure to challenge or reject that system shows very little moral growth. My main argument is that if we look at his actions, we might feel that he's, a little bit in the middle if he'd have learned the lesson, and maybe we'd have some sympathy for him. But the fact that he doesn't shows that he's part of the problem. He's willing to let this cycle continue. Now, the way I've constructed my conclusion, I'll show you through colour, is like this. Firstly, I think it's really sensible in your conclusion to directly answer the question that was given to you. Okay, make it really simple, make it really obvious, and if you can, go back to the quotation that was given to you and directly answer it. Okay, it will show a really convicted student who actually gives a full answer. It's okay if you say that, Gerald, I agree, he's not good or bad, or if you say, Gerald is wonderful, I love him, he's my friend. It's completely up to you what you say, but if you've got a good argument, try and return back to it very clearly at the end in the conclusion. The section I've put in green is where I've tried to summarize why I came to this conclusion. I've tried to be as simple as possible to tell you exactly why I think we should see him as a bad character, not as someone who's a little bit of good and a little bit of bad. And then finally, I've tried to answer by showing why I'm so certain about my views. And I feel like I've done this in a fairly decent way. You can have a look at that and see whether it would work for an essay on Gerald, or whether it could be adapted to the same kind of structure for an essay on a different character. Thank you so much for watching this revision video. I really hope it's been useful for you. Your exam is advancing very, very quickly. All I can say is that I hope you get the question that you really want to turn up, but I advise you to be revising all of the characters, all of the themes, to make sure that whatever turns up you'll be happy with. If Gerald turns up in your exam, I hope this video has been of some value to you. Good luck in your exam, guys.